In October, Albertans will be asked a question that could set in motion the breakup of the country. For decades, Western alienation has simmered in Alberta, a sense that the province's interests, its energy industry, and its identity have all been ignored or actively undermined by Ottawa. Premier Danielle Smith says hundreds of thousands of Albertans deserve to have their voices and frustrations heard. Not since the 1995 Quebec referendum has Canada faced a moment quite like this. And to help us better understand how we got here and what to expect in the lead up to October, I'm joined by two people who know Alberta politics very well. Janet Brown is a pollster, political commentator, and the principal of Janet Brown Opinion Research, and she's been tracking separatist sentiment in Alberta for nearly a decade. And Jen Gerson is a political columnist and co-editor of The Line. She's also one of the voices behind the Vote to Stay movement, alongside Jason Kenney, Monty Solberg, and Travis Taves, who describe themselves as proud Albertans who believe deeply in the province's future within a strong and united Canada. Thank you both for making time for this. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Janet, let me start with you. For people outside Alberta who may not have a clear sense of just how deep this separatist sentiment runs, your most recent polling from last month found 27% of Albertans say they would vote for separation. What does the rest of Canada need to understand about that number?
So yeah, that is the number we found the last time we asked the question. When we asked an almost identical question a year ago, we got 28%, so virtually the same number. And then over the past decade, we've just been asking people whether they agree or disagree with the idea that Alberta would be better off if it's separated. And what we find is that a third or slightly fewer people have been attached to this idea of Alberta separation for quite some time. But over the last decade, we haven't really seen these numbers shift. The intensity is definitely ratcheting up. That's been happening for a couple years now, and it's really ratcheted up in the last few days. But overall, it's just the intensity of the sentiment that's changing. But my data doesn't suggest that separatist sentiment is growing. If anything, my data suggests that federalist sentiment is growing.
And beyond the committed separatists, how much room is there for that number to grow during a referendum campaign? Because referenda are inherently, unpredictable. So among Albertans who feel alienated from Ottawa or who feel their province has been treated unfairly, but who aren't quite yet convinced that separating is the right answer, how persuadable are they to that argument?
So I think there's about 23% of Albertans who are locked in. There's no point talking to them. They want to separate and they won't be talked out of it. And then there's about another 14% of people who, they're feeling alienated from the rest of Canada, but they're not quite as right-wing as the hard separatists. They're not quite sold on separatism. You put those groups together, it's still not a majority. So the separatists are going to have a hard time getting to a majority. But for the stay folks, the goal isn't just to keep the separatists from achieving 50%. It's to suppress the separatist vote as low as possible. So if 20% of Albertans vote to separate, that's very different than a 40% vote to separate. So I think the ceiling is about 40%. I think the floor is about 20%. And that's what the next 5 months are going to be about.
Jen, just for the sake of, again, helping people outside Alberta better understand these pent-up grievances we hear so much about, what are they? Because Alberta typically has the highest proportion of high-income earners, the highest disposable income in the country. There's no provincial sales tax. Housing remains more affordable than in many other markets in the country. The Trudeau government bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline and its expansion project. So help us understand why so many Albertans are so set on leaving Canada.
Sure. So I think there's two pillars to that particular poll. One is all the things that you have stated are entirely correct. There are longstanding grievances around equalization and whether or not, for example, Quebec and Ontario really ought to be receiving the equalization that it does. There's a sense of disrespect that you have sort of a centralization of cultural and political power in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, and that these people fundamentally disrespect Alberta's resources while at the same time taking money out of the province in order to fund their own social safety nets. I think there are also growing frustrations with the sense that Canada can't build things. It takes way too long to get anything done. There have been policies and rules put in place that have stymied Alberta's resource extraction industry, which funds a significant portion of the country. So there's a lot of frustration around that. And I think there's also the harder thing to deal with, and that is a lot of it is a cultural frustration. We come out of, for lack of a better term, the woke years, a real sense that more conservative viewpoints have been alienated from the cultural institutions and also from institutions of power. Albertans don't see themselves reflected in a lot of federal institutions. There are a lot of interesting reasons for that. And they don't see their values reflected in a lot of federal institutions and cultural institutions. So there's a cultural element to this as well that's harder to pin down than merely the economic grievances.
And of course, you've planted your flag firmly in the stay camp, and you haven't hidden your frustrations about this referendum. You've argued that Albertans and really Canadians all across the country are being dragged into this referendum campaign, partly because Danielle Smith needs to appease her political base. Make that case for us. How did we get here?
Yeah, I think that this has now been pretty well established. Is that Danielle Smith has made a very in my view a very disingenuous and dishonest case for this referendum. The UCP was an explicitly Federalist party. When we went to the polls 3 years ago, we went to the polls on things like taxation, corporate taxes. There was the big controversial issue was whether or not the Sovereignty Act was a real thing or not. Right? Like nobody went to the polls to elect Danielle Smith thinking that we were going to be holding even a referendum on succession, much less risking an actual referendum on succession. Like nobody elected that. That wasn't in their platform. That wasn't a democratic mandate. Nobody gave them the legitimacy to do that. And my position on this has always been if you want to have the democratic legitimacy to foist that kind of a serious existential question on the rest of Albertans, you have a moral obligation to run on it. It's like you have an obligation to be upfront about the fact that that's your plan. But if I had written a column 3 or 4 years ago saying a vote for Danielle Smith is a vote for a separation referendum, the same people that are now advocating for that referendum would have accused me of having Danielle derangement syndrome, right? Like, so I think that what's happening here is very much an abusive process. It's very much an attempt to slip an unpopular view on to Albertans under cover of night. And I think it's being done very dangerously and very irresponsibly by people who are treating this as a tactic within a tactic within a tactic, under the assumption that the vote will come through and it's going to be a majority to stay in Canada and there will never be any consequences for this. And I think that is a dangerous assumption, not only because I think that I'm not as convinced that as Janet is that the floor is 40%. I don't think that is necessarily true, although I trust her polling on this right now. And also there are economic, political, and social consequences to holding a vote like this. And this is a dangerous gambit. And this isn't a tactic that we should ever be attempting unless we're serious.
Mm-hmm. We do know that the question will be put to Albertans, so let's talk about the actual question that they'll be asked in October. It does not ask whether Alberta should separate. It asks whether Alberta should remain a province of Canada or instead begin the process toward a binding referendum on separation. Jenna, what do you make of that question and its framing, and how might it change how people respond?
Before I answer that question, let's just step back. And I want to remind everybody that this is going to be one of 10 questions that gets asked to Albertans in October. So Jen is right when she said that this was not talked about during the last provincial election. But ever since the last provincial election, Danielle Smith has been laying the groundwork. She's been changing laws. She's been changing the rules. She's been sort of facilitating this idea that a referendum would come. And in February, she announced that we were going to be asked 9 other questions, and everybody knew that opened the door to be asked a 10th on this. So I just want to put that on the table. Jen said, when I talked about the floor and the ceiling, it's based on my read of public opinion right now. But the great thing about public opinion is it could change. And one of the things that is a dynamic that is just so hard to understand is how this complicated referendum's going to affect this question. Now, having said all of that, the question now is essentially what people are calling a referendum within a referendum. Danielle Smith, the courts prevented her from asking a question that asked if people wanted to leave Alberta. So now the question is, do you want to stay in Canada, or do you want to set off a process where we would hold another referendum? Now, it's a complicated question, though, but I'm not sure that it negates the polling that's been done until this point. I've got my polling. Other pollsters have asked different but similar questions, and we all seem to be netting out at about the same answer. A third of Albertans are really serious about the idea of going. A third can't believe we're even having this conversation. And then there's a group in the middle who aren't happy with Alberta's relationship with the rest of Canada, but they aren't sure that separation is the answer.
Jen, what's your take on the question, and more broadly maybe, how much risk do you think Danielle Smith is taking by going down this road, and to what extent does she risk really emboldening or unleashing something that she then find herself unable to control?
Yeah, so I want to say firstly, I think Janet Brown is like the top pollster in Alberta, and I absolutely take her research very, very seriously, and I think she's right. My fear about how this is going to play out is just remember is that, you know, if you take a poll of all Albertans, not all of those Albertans actually come out and show up and vote. The most motivated come up to vote, right? And right now, the most motivated are people who are angry, aggrieved, and want to separate. Secondly, the structure of the question, I think fundamentally makes it almost impossible to poll adequately, because now you've created a question that isn't about separating from Canada. Now you've created a question that allows the separatists to frame this as a costless protest vote. Show Ottawa, don't you worry, there will be no consequences. You can vote for the serious question later. And that means that people who are motivated by the cultural grievances that I'm talking about, motivated by the longstanding economic grievances in the sense of alienation, they'll show up. The ballot question isn't going to be the question that's written on the ballot. The ballot question is going to be some version of, are you happy with the status quo? Are you happy with Ottawa? Or are you alienated? And everybody who's motivated because they're alienated is going to show up to make a point. And that's how we get from 30%, 40%, 50%. I don't know how far that can go. And I'm not sure that anyone can know at this point how far that could go. So that's my big fear about the risks that are being unleashed here. As for Danielle Smith's future, I mean, anyone's guess at this point. Many of the separatist leaders are very upset that they are not going to be able to have a binding question on the ballot in October. Leaders like Jeff Rath have said we're going to start mobilizing people to oust her as leader. I don't know if they've got the juice to do it, to be perfectly frank. And if they don't, then all of this is for naught, isn't it? I mean, that's the terrible irony of all of it. I think that, you know, we did see a story in the Globe and Mail come out today that from the president of the UCP, the party, the governing party, saying, you know, we're going to be neutral in this question. We're not going to be pro-Canada or anti-Canada, which to me, again, is just indicative of just how far the rot goes within that party. Yeah, I mean, I think this creates an opening for the NDP to oust the UCP in the next election, or for the UCP to split on these grounds. The question is whether or not the NDP can actually capitalize on that, because I don't think anyone would even dispute in Alberta politics right now that the biggest single asset that Danielle Smith has is not hidden energy. So.
Well, certainly lots of uncertainty out there still, and very lucky to have you both to walk us through what we should be watching for in the months to come, but we will need to leave it there for today. Janet Brown, Jen Gerson, thanks again so much for making time for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.